I hope you're having a beautiful, lovely, wonderful day like I am. My day is going great because I spent the night down there in that little grove of trees on Flaming Gorge Reservoir here in extreme northern Utah. It's right over the border of Wyoming, and it's a huge lake built on the Green River. It's a monstrously big lake, known for its monstrously big fish, monstrously awesome geology, and even, as I discovered the other day, some monstrously big crawfish. Huge things like lobsters. Who knew? But enough about that. I'm here looking at geology, doing some fishing, of course, because it wouldn't be a trip to Flaming Gorge without that. I want to point out this little spine of sandstone behind me just off my camp. And I noticed it when I was out fishing yesterday. I don't know anything about this sandstone. I know that, according to the highway signs, I'm in the Baxter Shale, which is a Cretaceous marine shale unit about 90 to 85 million years old. So it's part of that big Western Interior Seaway. Lots of mud was dumping in from the eroding highlands to the west. There was some volcanic ash and all that kind of stuff. But every so often you get these little funny sands. So without knowing anything about it, I started looking at it, made note of some of the things I was seeing, and I realized a lot of my videos, I talk at a pretty high level. Unfortunately, I'm used to talking to industry people or grad students, and I kind of lose track of, hey, let's go back to basics. And that got hammered home for me a couple of days ago when I was at the University of Utah teaching a short course, and I was talking to undergraduates, and I realized a lot of the terminology I was using and a lot of things I was saying, I assumed they knew things like, of course, hummocky cross stratification, thalassinoides. Who doesn't know that? Well, yeah, Anton, a lot of people don't know that. So what I want to do with this video is slow down, take a walk through this sandstone body, and show you how I would go about, or how any sedimentologist, ichnologist would go about looking at a clastic sandstone body and figuring out what is the environment that this thing formed in. I don't know anything about it. All I have to go on is my observations. So I thought it would be kind of a step-by-step. Here's what to look for. Here's how we do it. If that sounds interesting, I hope you'll stick around, because I think we're going to see some really cool stuff in there. Right now, I'm going to warm up a little bit more, get some more coffee, wake up a little bit more, and I'll meet you on the rocks. All right, all caffeinated. It's getting warmer. It's getting sunnier. Walking by this invasive tamarisk. A lot of people like tamarisk and sail. It's so, characteristic of the West and the rivers. You see it around Moab a lot. There's even a restaurant called the Tamarisk in Green River, Utah. It's actually invasive. It's from the Nile River Valley in Egypt. It doesn't belong here. It sucks a lot of water out of the groundwater. That's beside the point. Here's that outcrop behind me. The lighting is really good on it right now. There's low angle. We can see some really great sedimentary structures. We can see some great trace fossils, some little features on the surfaces and burrowing through. You can see the outcrop is not very big. It extends just as far as the lake right there. It just stops because it goes underwater. It's not very thick. It seems to have a shale sitting on top of it. It seems to be completely encased in shale. Again, we're assuming that's the Baxter Shale because that's what the highway sign said. That's also what Rock D told me, or Rocked. I never know how it's pronounced. Somebody tell me in the comments. Let me know if it's Rock D or Rocked. I can't keep track of this stuff. New technology. Anyway, normally what I would do, and what I would recommend any of my students do, or anybody I'm working with, is step back and get, as I mentioned in a different video, the karma of the outcrop. Do you see it pinching out? What's the stratal surfaces doing in there? Are they kind of dipping down? Are they horizontal? Do you see a trend in grain sizes, coarsening up, thinning up, fining up, thickening up? What are you seeing in here? That's a real challenge with this outcrop. All we kind of have is this flaggy sand. Can't really see whether it's coursing or fining up or thinning or thickening up. All we see is what we've got here. So I'm going to start looking at the slabs, and as we see stuff, and as I see stuff, I'll point it out, and then we'll kind of put it all together into a big interpretive story at the end. So let's start at the beginning, and there's this really nice big piece right here in the sunlight. Let's follow the light, see what's out there on that surface. Wow, good decision to start with this, if I do say so myself. Right off the bat, you can see a couple of really cool characteristics of the sandstone. First of all, grain size. Well, it's very fine grain to fine grain. Might be hard to see on the video, but trust me on that, very fine to fine grain. Look what my finger is pointing to, though. we've got these big sinuous structures. Some of them have little branches off them. This one seems to have a little bit of an enlargement where the smaller branch is coming off the big one. There's a lot of these things throughout here. And here's another one here, kind of doing a branch with an enlarged node. Actually, that's two separate ones. Take a look at this. It's one going that way and a separate one coming this way. That has implications for what the trace fossil type is, and we'll get to that in a second. Let's just first see what we see. Description, then interpretation. Here's one that actually does seem to branch. So there's a branch here, and it's got an arm, a second arm, a third arm, and it branches again. So we've got branching. We've got ones that look like they're branching and might not be branching, but they're all smooth surfaces. There's nothing that has any kind of pellet lining. And these are all horizontal. This is a depositional surface. And I know that because here are some ripple crests. Fairly straight ripple crests. All right. And, you know, we say description versus interpretation. It's kind of hard to mistake these for anything else. You can tell the ripple crests because they're a little bit asymmetrical. And the lighting, it's a little bit tricky to see here, but this side is steeper than this side. This side is steeper than this side, and this side is steeper than that side. So what we're seeing is asymmetrical ripples that are typical of, here we go, interpretation, traction currents, as opposed to wave ripples. So we're seeing something that's got traction currents, not wave ripples. Wave ripples are more symmetrical. So let's talk interpretation real quick. You know, description-wise, we're in a very fine-grained sand. Description-wise, we've got asymmetrical ripples. Description-wise, we've got these smooth line burrows. Some of them branch, some are sinuous, none have pellets. Interpretation-wise, this looks like traction currents of a sea floor bottom. And I say a sea floor because these trace fossils are things like Paleophycus, where they're not branching, things like Thalassinoides, where they are branching. And Thalassinoides is a marine trace made by polychaete worms and ghost shrimp, among other things. There's some little fish that make Thalassinoides. But generally, if you see bioturbation made of Paleophycus, Thalassinoides, and strong ripples, there is also these tiny, ooh, take a look at that, tiny pairs of apertures. There's one, here's another, here's another. Now we're getting somewhere. Look at that, tiny little pairs of apertures. Because it's a surface, it's hard to see what's going on cross-section, but there's a trace fossil called Arenicolaides. There's also one called Diplocriterium. Amphipods make Diplocriterium. Also worms make Arenicolaides, so depending on which this is, it could be worms or amphipods. So there's a fairly good diversity, at least, you know, 3 ichnotaxa here, combined with these asymmetrical ripples. That's typical of a marine setting, a marine environment. Now, it could be brackish, it could be open marine, but it's not fresh water. Not bad for a first slab. Let's see what else we got. So I was just looking at that slab right there, and down the hill, you see some more chunks of rock. Check out that one, though. Ripples galore. Nice straight crested ripples. So if we had any question about the interpretation of those as ripples, take a look at these. This is beautiful, beautiful ripples. Looks like some surface traces, some little ones, but nothing as big as what we saw up there. So, you know, that supports the interpretation of those being ripples. Then, you know, of course, look at that. There's some really obvious ripples. So I think the question as to whether they're ripples, we can put that one to bed. And then I noticed that this slab, as I was looking, I said, oh boy, here's a trace fossil. But look really closely at it. It's got pellets on the wall. Those pellets are made by the animal, usually a ghost shrimp, trying to support the surface of the open wall, because if this sand is prone to collapsing, they're essentially making little bricks out of mucus and sand pellets. So they're lining their chimney, just like you put bricks in a well to stop it collapsing in on itself. That's a trace called Ophiomorpha. Interpretation-wise, this is a ghost shrimp, probably the same kind of shrimp that made Thalassinoides up there. The same shrimp that makes the pelleted chamber, the pelleted tunnels will also make unpelleted tunnels. They're lazy. If they don't have to support the open aperture, they won't. So if they don't have to make pellets, they won't. So Ophiomorpha very often actually leads directly into Thalassonoides because the same exact animal made it. All right, so again, marine, but look at this. Holy cow. There's all kinds of chunks of shell material here, and also big open areas where there used to be mudstones, rip-up clasts. Now that's an interpretation. Let's stick with description. Description-wise, you see these kind of rounded open areas. Interpretation-wise, these are very common where you had mud or silt that got ripped up from somewhere else, dumped in, and now it's eroded and leaves behind these molds. So these are molds of ripped up clasts of mud or silt. We don't know which because it's gone. But what's not open for interpretation is these shell fragments that we're seeing in here. So there's a lot of shell fragments like that one. And you can see the original aragonite is in there, the mother of pearl. You can see some of them even look like little shell fragments. So we've got a mixed assemblage of shell fragments, rip-up clasts, and even Ophiomorpha. So we got a chunk of sand with a rip-up lag deposit, got shells, got rip-up clasts, got Ophiomorpha. This is starting to sound more like a pretty high energy system, and that's pretty typical of environments we get a lot of storms coming through. So let's see if we actually see any storm wave bed in any storm wave indications. Up there we have ripples, there we have ripples. There's something interesting going on in the side view of that first bed though. Maybe we should take a look at that again and see what we see there. Never ignore an exposure. The surface is always exciting, but look at that. Now that the light isn't on the surface to draw your eye, all of a sudden you start looking at the side view. Let's take a look at that. Okay, yeah. Take a look at that lower unit right there. That seems to have slightly downward dropping bedding. Then it comes across, kind of goes up, and then comes back down. But more impressively, look at this. Look at this low angle bedding in here. So it's low angle there, kind of more horizontal there, kind of dips down. But then as we get to this surface, look at here, it kind of comes down and then back up. A little bit of a smile. That looks like hummocky cross stratification. So we've got a bed that seems to be sharp based. There's even what looks like a little scour. So description, we're still in that very fine grained sand. It's a bed that's got a scour, some low angle bedding. Some of that low angle bedding seems to go undulatory, kind of U-shaped. Then it kind of comes up and forms sort of an inverse U, sort of a convex up and convex down. Then you translate into some rippled beds at the very top. And on top of those ripples is where we saw our trace fossils to begin with. Interpretation-wise, this is a really good storm bed, a tempestite. And storm beds occur when you have big storms somewhere at sea, usually on the shelf, and it rips up a whole bunch of sediment from somewhere. Either that sediment's already sitting on the shelf or it's being deposited by a river at a delta, and that sand gets ripped up and scoured into the bottom. So the bottom of the seafloor is sitting here with either sand or shale, and the storm orbital rips into it, scours it out, and then starts accumulating sand. And the sand has a characteristic hummocky and or swaley cross stratification. And the hummocks look like this kind of undulatory convex down and convex up stratigraphy. At the end of the storm, as the storm is sort of waning and the orbitals stop reaching the bottom, then you start getting more fair weather wave currents, and you maybe get some little traction currents, and that would lead to these little rippled patches on top. So big storm wave orbitals moving a lot of sand, creating hummocks and swales. Then as the storm dies, you start getting some maybe longshore currents, bottom currents, reworking the sand into ripples, then the whole thing is abandoned. And that lag deposit down below in this bed is typical of a storm bed. The base of a storm bed typically has a lot of ripped up material because, again, it's moving through and churning up a lot of the previously deposited sediment. Not bad. And, you know, sometimes people use color to differentiate facies or sediment type, and that's really problematical here because this lower part of the outcrop, everything is very white. The upper part is very tan. Now, in some areas, that might indicate differential fluid flow. So the white might effectively be leached out. It might be bleached by groundwater moving through, dissolving minerals, and leaving it behind. And in some cases, in shore faces in the Western interior, coal sitting on top of the shore face introduces carbonic acid via groundwater infiltration. And that carbonic acid dissolves minerals from the highly porous and permeable sand and leaves it behind in the less porous and permeable sand. Is that what's happening here? That is not what's happening here. In fact, what's happening here is we've got Flaming Gorge Reservoir behind us, and when the water level is high, algae coats these rocks. When the algae dies and dries out, it turns really white. It's got a lot of calcium carbonate in it. If you dropped acid on this, it'll fizz. So you're seeing a coating on the rock, not something that's been leached out. Tip for the day. There's also some cool pits like this. Now this pit is fairly large, conical. There's a couple of interpretations for this. It's hard to see in this section, but it could be either an anemone trace, something like Conicnus or a very large Bergaria, or it could also be a fish feeding trace. Rays, stingrays, and various bony fish make feeding traces. When they grab a shrimp or worm, they come up with their mouth and fill up their pharynx, their pharyngeal sac, and their gills with a mouthful of water, and then they go boosh and shoot it down. Creates an impact crater like that, and then they slurp up the hapless animals. It could be a fish feeding trace. Piscicnus, it's called. Again, hard to tell from this section. We really want a cross section through the rock, but alas, we do not have that here. All right, we've been seeing a lot of natural casts of thalassinoides, in other words, sand-filled tubes. Here's open aperture thalassinoides with no casting. This is the actual burrow itself. It looks like a couple of branches here. Looks like some more in here. Here's an open aperture there. So that's the depositional surface, and there's the burrows not filled in with sand. They might have filled in with mud, and that's why they're still open like that. All right. Some more possible hummocks and swales. In fact, yeah, that looks a lot like hummocky and swaley cross stratification to me. Gorgeous hummocky cross stratification. See, there's the antiform. It's convex up, and then it goes convex down. Oh man, that is hummocky. Let me just show you that one more time. That is so spectacular. Take any surface in that white bed and follow it up, 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 and then watch it dip down, down, down. So classic hummocky cross stratification sitting on top of shale with combined flow ripples. We're starting to see a good story here come together of storm influence on a sea floor, not necessarily a shore face. We'll get to that in a discussion. Let's take a look at some more rocks, and then we'll put it all together. Here's something I mentioned before, Paleophycus. This could be Paleophycus. Very simple, not branching, has a mud lining so it stands out. So that's very likely a Paleophycus. It looks like there might be a few more of them in here. Polychaete worms. Here's a thalassinoides, no doubt about this. It's actually branching. So we've got shrimp or large worms. We've got polychaete worms making Paleophycus. Back there we saw an Ophiomorpha, consistent with shrimp making at least some of these thalassinoides. Just chewed up, happy organisms burrowing in here and making a living. Typical of an open marine setting. Nice rock. I wish I could carry this home. This would be awesome in the living room. So now I'm just kind of rock hopping, walking along the boulders. Looks like there's some hummocks or swales. Actually, the bottom part of the hummock is called the swale. This looks like swaley cross stratification in this rock in front of me. Oh yeah, here's another, just like the other ones we've been seeing, strongly rippled. Lots of thalassinoides, lots of Paleophycus. It even looks like there's the little paired apertures of our friends, the Arenicolaides, or maybe Diplocriterion. Trying to see if there's any pellets of an Ophiomorpha. None that really jump out. So this might have been too cohesive a sediment. It didn't need to make a pelleted lining. Oh, look at this. Here's some cross bedding that's suggestive of hummocky, but there's also some true cross bedding in there. So that's higher energy, and there's some more traction currents going on. So in addition to the hummocks that we saw back there and the swales, we're starting to get, as we get higher up, because those hummocks and swales were lower down in the section, as we're getting higher up, we seem to be maybe getting some more traction currents, some trough cross bedding, small scale, if not trough cross bedding, like that stuff there. Let's zoom in on that. See those foresets? That's what I'm saying, maybe trough cross bedding. These seem pretty high angle to be hummocky. So we might be seeing traction currents. And then, yeah, it stops there in the shale. So let's take a look at these rocks here. Looks like, oh, some vertical stuff. This needs to be investigated. Yeah, my highly scientific terminology of vertical stuff. By that, I mean vertical trace fossils. So burrows, generally in lower energy parts of the system, tend to be horizontal. With little energy in the system, animals can burrow horizontally. They can feed, dwell, breed, do whatever they want in horizontal burrows because nothing's collapsing in on them. If it's high energy with a lot of sediment moving, burrows tend to be vertical because these animals need to be able to move up and down. So if the sediment gets piled on top of them, they tend to want to be able to vertically escape that, not necessarily escape, but equilibrate. Because a lot of times they have an open pit at the surface and they feed there, do whatever, and then retreat for dwelling, like the Sarlacc pit in Return of the Jedi, or like an antlion or a doodlebug or something like that. So animals living in high energy, really sandy environments tend to create vertical burrows. And sure enough, that's what we're starting to see in the upper part of the sandstone. Take a look at this one. Really beautiful little Ophiomorpha with the pellets. This is a cross-sectional view of the bed, but he's vertically going down. And sure enough, here's another one. A little bit curved. And again, Ophiomorpha is made by the same thing that makes the Lasanoides. It's ghost shrimp. Not to be outdone, here are some horizontal ones. So look at this. We've got some horizontal Ophiomorpha. Here's a longitudinal view. The little guy was living in there going dig, 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 dig like this. Tiny little shrimp makes this. Here are some cross-sectional views of Ophiomorpha burrows. There's a lot of them in here. And there are some vertical ones. So we're in a system with vertical and horizontal burrows. It's not all vertical. It's not all horizontal. We're sort of getting to a mixed energy part of this sandstone body. Down below is fairly low energy with occasional storms coming through and ripping up clasts and depositing, but a lot of ripples, fairly low energy sediment accumulation happening. Here it's looking like maybe higher energy as we're getting shallower. And on a sandstone body, usually any kind of sand body in the marine realm, as it shallows up, you're compressing fluid over the top, which creates acceleration. Just like a plane's wing has that, convex up shape to it to create acceleration. That's what happens with fluid. So it creates higher energy. Higher energy means little animals have to reinforce their burrows with pellets or clay or something like that. So we seem to be getting higher up and higher energy, shoaling upward, higher energy upward. Oh, look at that. Beautiful Ophiomorpha by the dawn's light. Man, that is spectacular. Again, wish I could take it home. I got way too many rocks though. Looking around at the uppermost part of this exposure, we're seeing a lot of that higher angle crossbedding. We're seeing Ophiomorpha like crazy. Here's some of that higher angle crossbedding like that, coming down at angles like this. Not quite hummocky or swaley, unless it's high angle hummocks and swales, and it's frustratingly difficult to follow across. Now, hey, hang on. Here's an indication of a hummock. So we're still in the realm of maybe storm wave orbitals, which interpretation-wise suggests we're below fair weather wave base and we're still at or near storm wave base. So maybe a combination of storm and fair weather. So we're at the very top of the outcrop now, and here's the uppermost surfaces of the outcrop, and we're back into ripples. Strongly rippled, really bioturbated. Lots of small things, though. Lots of small burrows, small paleophycus, Maybe a larger vertical burrow here, but lots of teeny tiny little scratches and scrapes. Look at that. Interesting. Okay, here's another one of those possible Bergaria or Conycnus or fish feeding traces. Tons and tons of little scratches and not complete trails, but little indentations, along with some Paleophycus. We don't have any more Thalassonoides. We don't have any more Ophiomorpha. We've got maybe these vague outlines of feeding pits or anemone traces. So a different trace fossil collection here. Still ripples, different trace fossils, and then we get the shale. What is that telling us? So seeing the differences in the trace fossils and the sediments and the sedimentary structures in these rocks compared to what we were just seeing immediately below with all the Ophiomorpha and the higher angle hummocks and maybe even some trough cross bedding, this suggests that energy has really decreased. Large open aperture burrows like Thalassonoides, Ophiomorpha indicate a lot of energy, moderate energy at least, a lot of oxygen, plenty of nutrients. Seeing tiny little scratches and scrapes like this, and largely simple horizontal line tubes like Paleophycus, suggests that it's not as energetic, there's not as much oxygen or nutrients. It's just not as exciting of a place to live as where the Ophiomorpha and Thalassonoides were. That's typical of a flooding surface, a transgressive surface. And as a result, the bottom mudded in, it's silted in, shaled in. So you start getting a lot lower energy and finer grained sediment accumulation, which might have decreased oxygen, might have decreased nutrients, and resulted in a different fauna. So the transgressive tops of these sand bodies very commonly have a trace fossil assemblage that looks a lot different than the highly active part of the sand body. And that's exactly what we see here. So this is the transgressive surface of the sand. I think we've seen enough now to put together a complete story here. It's an interpretation. It's always an interpretation. And I guarantee if you're a sedimentologist watching this, you probably have a different interpretation than me. And if we had 3 or 4 of us out here on the outcrop, there would be a debate that would go on into the wee hours. And that's okay. I'm going to give you my interpretation. Feel free to agree or not. All right, back to the start. This is where we began this morning, looking at that slab behind me with the really nice ripples and trace fossils. Then we worked along the outcrop, looked from bottom to top. It's a thin little outcrop. It's not very thick, maybe about 16, 17 feet, so maybe about 5 meters thick. Summarizing what we saw, the lower part has a lot of ripples. There's a lot of horizontal trace fossils, shrimp and worms, including little paired Diplocraterian or Arenicolaides traces. So a fair amount of life. And as you can see, even down here below me right now, there's ripples all over. So low energy, not super high energy, lots of living organisms. And then as we started to get a little bit higher in the stratigraphy here, we started seeing hummocky and swaly crossbedding and a change in the trace fossils too, starting to get some larger diameter Thalassonoides and including some Ophiomorphas. As we got higher up in the hummocky and got cleaner and cleaner in that hummocky, we started getting some what looks like true trough crossbedding and almost entirely Ophiomorpha. We lost the horizontal guys, higher energy vertical burrows of Ophiomorpha, but still some horizontal Ophiomorpha, not entirely vertical. From that, we then had a transgressive surface. There's no strong trough crossbedding, there's no planar crossbedding, nothing indicating that we've actually made the complete switch over from storm wave dominated orbitals to linear, shallow traction currents that you expect in an upper shore face. So everything here suggests that we're within the realm of storm wave base, maybe barely getting to fair weather wave base. In the Western Interior, by looking at analogs to this in other clastic deposits, seems like storm weather wave base or storm wave base in the Western Interior was typically around 15 to 20 meters deep, give or take. And that's, close to some of the conclusions that oceanographers have drawn today. There's a lot of variables, don't need to get into that right now. In the Western Interior Cretaceous, it seems like 15 to 20 meters is about storm wave base. So it's a fair bet that this rock represents sediment that was accumulating in about 60, 70 feet of water, maybe, give or take. Nothing above it other than that transgressive surface, so it flooded. So now we get into the interpretation story of it. Is it a shore face? A lot of people look at hummocks and swales and Ophiomorpha and say, shore face, because you find hummocks and swales in a shore face. Shore faces, however, are very distinctive geomorphic features. They are shore attached. They are sand bodies that are accreting onto a shoreline and represent either deltaic deposition of a deltaic shore face or shore face accumulation by longshore accumulation of sand. And we see that on the Texas Gulf Coast right now. There are shore faces and shore faces of barrier islands fed by deltas many miles, hundreds of miles laterally away from them. The Mississippi Delta is an example of sand coming in on the Mississippi, getting swept westward by the Gulf Stream and accreting on shore faces on the Texas Gulf Coast. But the shore attached. Do we have any indication this thing is shore attached? No, we don't. We don't actually see anything that suggests it is. It might have been. There's nothing to say it's not, but you don't see anything that says it is. To be convinced it was shore attached, it would have been great to be able to follow this out landward, which would have been to the west, and see, do we actually get those thickening and coarsening upward, upper shore face, trough cross beds to foreshore, low angle beds to coastal plain deposits. We simply don't have that here. What can we say about it? We can say it's increasing in energy up. It's shallowing upward, and that shallowing up, that accumulation on the seafloor is probably what was helping increase energy because we compressed fluid over the top of it. That increased energy resulted in a higher energy sedimentation, which was more sand, less mud. And sure enough, it's more heterolithic at the base and almost thicker, more sand dominated at the top. I can't tell you for sure whether this is a shore face. I can't tell you whether it's an isolated, what we call shelf sands or some sort of sand ridge like that. All I can tell you from this outcrop is it's marine, because we have the trace fossils that say it's marine. It's below fair weather wave base. It's in the zone of storm waves. And that's from the hummocks, the swales, and the lack of really abundant traction features. And based on the biostratigraphy of the surrounding area and what I know of the region, it's Cretaceous. So we know it's a Cretaceous, shallowing, shoaling upward marine sand. That's what I can say about this sandstone. I hope you thought this was kind of interesting, maybe entertaining, maybe you learned a thing or two. If nothing else, hey, it's a great way to kill some time on whatever day you're watching it. Thanks for watching. I'm going to get back to looking at rocks. I may or may not make more of these step-by-step videos of how to go through and really pick apart an outcrop. Sort of depends. Let me know in the comments if you think it's worthwhile. I'm all ears. Always happy to take suggestions. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the outcrop. I got to get back to fishing now. Take it easy.
Yes, science!